Hello, everyone. Welcome to Storytime with Moog. I am Moog, and today we are continuing with Frankenstein by Mary Shelley, starting with chapter 5. And this is the 1818 edition. Yeah, I don't have any reading updates either. I have not been reading. What I've been doing is playing Vampire Survivors. I'm obsessed. It's so good. I am obsessed with this game. It's just totally one of those games where you like think that you're only gonna play for like a couple minutes. You're like, oh, I have like 30 minutes. I'll just play this game really quick. And then hours later, you're like, oh, I guess I should go to bed. It's so good. And just the reward system is just amazing. Yeah, I guess I haven't really talked games on here in a while. I haven't really been playing a lot of games though. I don't know what I'm doing. Like, I haven't been reading, I haven't been playing games. What is going on? I can't tell you. Today we're starting with chapter 5. Very exciting stuff. What has happened last time? Okay, we got our basics for our structure. So, oh man, I totally forgot what our name is. But we are on a ship very beginning writing letters to our dearest sister and just saying like we don't know when we're going to come back. I'm exploring lands that haven't been explored. I don't know anything. Like that sort of thing. And there's a series of letters that we are getting just from his perspective. And one of the letters details that there was somebody on a sled being pulled by dogs, and then they couldn't really see because they were kind of far away. They're like surrounded by ice and snow. And like the next day or 2 days later, they found somebody who was also on a sled, but just like laying in the ground, and only one of the dogs was alive. So they like pull the guy up, and the guy is Victor Frankenstein. And we're like, what are you doing? Like, what's happening? And Victor is like, let me tell you a tale. So the rest of the story is us writing down what Victor is going through. So we have those like degrees of separation, which is fun. And so we have the early years of Victor Frankenstein. It's him, I think he's the oldest of his siblings. He has a brother, and then at the age of 4, his parents adopted his cousin and like brought her in. At a very early age, he super enjoyed like teaching himself more than being in school and stuff like that. So he was reading a lot of sciencey books. He was reading a lot of Agrippa, and his dad called it sad trash, which I love that description. Several years later, he goes off to university, and he's taking science courses, and one of the professors says, "Oh, you read this sad trash? Like, how could you? Like, all of the ideas of it are so antiquated, and like, that's ridiculous. This is what you should be studying instead." And of course, Victor Frankenstein is like a little off put by this, but he goes to another lecture by one of the professors that he is recommended, and this professor is like, "Ah, Agrippa, yes, let's talk about how science has evolved." And so like his approach was much more interesting to Frankenstein, and so like he gets into um different types of sciences and is studying them, and one of them is death and reanimation. And in doing that, he's like, one of the studies that he did, um one of the experiments that he does is just like watching a corpse decompose. And he's like, well, what if I reanimate a corpse? So instead of starting small, which he thought about, he was like, I'm going to make a 8 foot tall man, and I'm going to get all of my body parts from local slaughterhouses, and what could possibly go wrong? So he animates it. It's beautiful, but also terrifying. And the monster, which he calls him so lovingly, leaves the house. And so he runs after him and is trying to find him. And every corner he turns, he thinks that he's going to run into him. And instead, he runs into one of his friends that he like left when he went to university. And his friend's like, "Oh, hello, good to see you. It's been a long time. I too am here at the university to study." So they go back to Victor's place, and Victor is still like terrified that he's going to run into the monster and that his friend is going to see him. And his friend realizes like Victor's not doing so well. He's clearly sick. Victor tells him everything that has happened. His friend is like, "I don't really believe you, but sure, since you keep saying it, it must be the reason that you're sick." Um, what else has happened? Let me flip back to see like, oh, that's right. His friend is taking care of him. He like Victor gets more energetic and like his strength back and all that, and he's like, "Oh, yes, I do miss my family back home. I just haven't written to them, blah blah blah." And then his friend's like, "Ah, yes, here is a letter that has been sitting here waiting for you for several days." That is where we left off. And chapter 5 picks up right there, hopping into the letters. Oh, his friend's name is Clerval. And we wonder why I can't remember his names. Clerval. Okay, it's fine. So, let's get cozy, let's get comfy, and let's start chapter 5. Chapter 5. Clerval then put the following letter into my hands. To V. Frankenstein. My dear cousin, I cannot describe to you the uneasiness we have all felt concerning your health. We cannot help imagining that your friend Clerval conceals the extent of your disorder, for it is now several months since we have seen your handwriting, and all this time you have been obliged to dictate your letters to Henry. Surely, Victor, you must have been exceedingly ill, and this makes us all very wretched. As much so nearly as after the death of your dear mother. My uncle was almost persuaded that you were indeed dangerously ill, and could hardly be restrained from undertaking a journey to Ingolstadt. That's the university that he's at. Clerval always writes that you are getting better. I eagerly hope that you will confirm this intelligence soon in your own handwriting, for indeed, Victor, we are all very miserable on this account. Relieve us from this fear, and we shall be the happiest creatures in the world. Your father's health is now so vigorous that he appears 10 years younger since last winter. Ernest also is so much improved that you would hardly know him. He is now nearly 16 and has lost that sickly appearance which he had some years ago. He has grown quite robust and active. My uncle and I conversed a long time last night about what profession Ernest should follow. His constant illness when young has deprived him of the habits of application, and now that he enjoys good health, he is continually in the open air, climbing the hills or rowing on the lake. I therefore proposed that he should be a farmer, which you know, cousin, is a favorite scheme of mine. A farmer's is a very healthy, happy life, and the least hurtful, or rather, the most beneficial profession of any. My uncle had an idea of his being educated as an advocate, that through his interest he might become a judge. But, besides that, he is not at all fitted for such an occupation. It is certainly more creditable to cultivate the earth for the sustenance of man than to be the confidant and sometimes the accomplice of his vices, which is the profession of a lawyer. I said that the employments of a prosperous farmer, if they are not more honorable, they were at least a happier species of occupation than that of a judge, whose misfortune it was always to meddle with the dark side of human nature. My uncle smiled and said that I ought to be an advocate myself, which put an end to the conversation on that subject. And now I must tell you a little story that will please, and perhaps amuse you. Do you not remember Justine Moritz? Probably you do not. I will relate her history, therefore, in a few words. Madame Moritz, her mother, was a widow with 4 children, of whom Justine was the third. This girl had always been the favorite of her father, but, through a strange perversity, her mother could not endure her, and, after the death of M. Moritz, treated her very ill. My aunt observed this, and, when Justine was 12 years of age, prevailed on her mother to allow her to live at her house. The republican institutions of our country have produced simpler and happier manners than those which prevail in the great monarchies that surround it. Hence, there is less distinction between the several classes of its inhabitants, and the lower orders being neither so poor nor so despised. Their manners are more refined and moral. A servant in Geneva does not mean the same thing as a servant in France and England. Justine, thus received in our family, learned the duties of a servant, a condition which, in our fortunate country, does not include the idea of ignorance and a sacrifice of the dignity of a human being. After what I have said, I dare you will remember the heroine of my little tale, for Justine was a great favorite of yours, and I recollect you once remarked that if you were in an ill humor, one glance from Justine could dissipate it, for the same reason that Ariosto gives concerning the beauty of Angelica. She looked so frank-hearted and happy. My aunt conceived a great attachment for her, by which she was induced to give her an education superior to that which she had at first intended. This benefit was fully repaid. Justine was the most grateful little creature in the world. I do not mean that she made any professions. I never heard one pass her lips, but you could see by her eyes that she almost adored her protectress. Although her disposition was happy, and in many respects inconsiderate, yet she paid the greatest attention to every gesture of my aunt. She thought her the model of all excellence, and endeavored to imitate her phraseology and manners, so that even now she often reminds me of her. When my dearest aunt died, everyone was too much occupied in their own grief to notice poor Justine, who had attended her during her illness with the most anxious affection. Poor Justine was very ill, but other trials were reserved for her. One by one her brothers and sister died, and her mother, with the exception of her neglected daughter, was left childless. The conscience of the woman was troubled. She began to think that the deaths of her favorites was a judgment from heaven to chastise her partiality. She was a Roman Catholic, and I believe her confessor confirmed the idea which she had conceived. Accordingly, a few months after your departure for Ingolstadt, Justine was called home by her repentant mother. Poor girl! She wept when she quitted our house. She was much altered since the death of my aunt. Grief had given softness and a winning mildness to her manners, which had before been remarkable for vivacity. Nor was her residence at her mother's house of a nature to restore her gaiety. The poor woman was very vacillating in her repentance. She sometimes begged Justine to forgive her unkindness, but much oftener accused her of having caused the deaths of her brothers and sister. Perpetual fretting at length threw Madame Moritz into a decline, which at first increased her irritability, but she is now at peace forever. She died on the first approach of cold weather, at the beginning of this last winter. Justine has returned to us, and I assure you I love her tenderly. She is very clever and gentle, and extremely pretty. As I mentioned before, her mien and her expressions continually remind me of my dear aunt. I must also say a few words to you, my dear cousin, my little darling William. I wish you could see him. He is very tall of his age, with sweet, laughing blue eyes, dark eyelashes, and curling hair. When he smiles, 2 little dimples appear on his cheek, which are rosy with health. He has already had one or two little wives, but Louisa Byron is his favorite, a pretty little girl of 5 years of age. Now, dear Victor, I dare say you wish to be indulged in a little gossip concerning the good people of Geneva. The pretty Miss Mansfield has already received the congratulatory visits of her approaching marriage with the young Englishman John Melbourne, Esquire. Her ugly sister, Manon, married M. Duvillard, the rich banker, last autumn. Your favorite schoolfellow, Louis Manoir, has suffered several misfortunes since the departure of Clerval from Geneva, but he has already recovered his spirits and is reported to be on the point of marrying a very lively, pretty Frenchwoman, Madame Tavernier. She is a widow and much older than Manoir, but she is very much admired and a favorite with everybody. I have written myself into good spirits, dear cousin, yet I cannot conclude without again anxiously inquiring concerning your health. Dear Victor, if you are not very ill, write yourself, and make your father and all of us happy, or I cannot bear to think of the other side of the question. My tears already flow. Adieu, my dearest cousin, Elizabeth Lavenza, Geneva, March 18th, 17 M dash. So that's the end of her letter. So Victor, since going to college at Ingolstadt, has not written because he has been so busy and so absorbed in his work with reanimating. So he hasn't been doing that. He's been purely focused on this and is now like making himself sick with worry and obsession and probably not really taking care of himself all that well, all that great. Probably not really taking care of himself, period. So we have this letter from Elizabeth, his cousin who his parents adopted, just saying like how she's doing generally, but then also like how other people in his previous life when he lived there are doing, like with what's her name? I immediately forgot her name. Madame Moritz and her daughter. So just catching up. Just catching up. All right. Dear, dear Elizabeth, I exclaimed when I had read her letter. I will write instantly and relieve them from the anxiety they must feel. I wrote, and this exertion greatly fatigued me, but my convalescence had commenced and proceeding regularly. In another fortnight, I was able to leave my chamber. Can't remember any name except Clerval now. I know. Clerval will forever be in my brain because it is so wildly different. All other names have been erased. I'm sorry, Dr. Franken what? One of my first duties on my recovery was to introduce Clerval, speak of the devil, to the several professors of the university. In doing this, I underwent a kind of rough usage, ill befitting the wounds that my mind had sustained. Ever since that fatal night, the end of my labors and the beginning of my misfortunes, I had conceived a violent antipathy even to the name of natural philosophy. When I was otherwise quite restored to health, the sight of a chemical instrument would renew all the agony of my nervous symptoms. Henry saw this, and had removed all my apparatus from my view. He had also changed my apartment, for he perceived that I had acquired a dislike for the room which had previously been my laboratory. But these cares of Clerval were made of no avail when I visited the professors. M. Waldman inflicted torture when he praised, with kindness and warmth, the astonishing progress I had made in the sciences. That's right. He noted last time that, like, while he was studying and doing all of these other things, he had, like, greatly improved even, like, the instruments that scientists use, like, in the class, and it was, like, wild and amazing. He soon perceived that I disliked the subject, but, not guessing the real cause, He attributed my feelings to modesty, and changed the subject from my improvement to the science itself, with a desire, as I evidently saw, of drawing me out. What could I do? He meant to please, and he tormented me. I felt as if he had placed carefully, one by one, in my view those instruments which were to be afterwards used in putting me to a slow and cruel death. I writhed under his words, yet dared not exhibit the pain I felt. Clerval, whose eyes and feelings were always quick in discerning the sensations of others, declined the subject, alleging, in excuse, his total ignorance, and the conversation took a more general turn. I thanked my friend from my heart, but I did not speak. I saw plainly that he was surprised, but he never attempted to draw my secret from me, and although I loved him with a mix of affection and reverence that knew no bounds, yet I could never persuade myself to confide to him that event which was so often present to my recollection, but which I feared the detail to another would only impress more deeply. M. Krempe was not equally docile, and in my condition at that time of almost insupportable sensitiveness, his harsh, blunt encomiums gave me even more pain than the benevolent approbation of M. Waldman. "Damn the fellow!" cried he. "Why, M. Clerval, I assure you he has outstripped us all. Ay, stare if you please, but it is nevertheless true. A youngster who, but a few years ago, believed Cornelius Agrippa as firmly as the gospel, has now set himself at the head of the university, and if he is not soon pulled down, we shall all be out of countenance. Ay, ay," continued he, observing my face expressive of suffering, "M. Frankenstein is modest, an excellent quality in a young man. Young men should be different of themselves, you know, M. Clerval. I was myself when young, but that wears out in a very short time." Okay, so Krempe was the first university professor that Victor met and was like, "Agrippa, trash, sad trash." And then Waldman was the second professor that he had like more respect for his approach to science and scientists and like the growth that science has gone through without disdaining previous views. M. Krempe had now commenced a eulogy on himself, which happily turned the conversation from a subject that was so annoying to me. Clerval was no natural philosopher. His imagination was too vivid for the minutiae of science. Languages were his principal study, and he sought, by acquiring their elements, to open a field for self-instruction on his return to Geneva. Persian, Arabic, and Hebrew gained his attention after he had made himself perfectly master of Greek and Latin. For my own part, idleness had ever been irksome to me, and now that I wished to fly from reflection and hated my former studies, I felt great relief in being the fellow pupil with my friend, and found not only instruction, but consolation in the works of the Orientalists. I feel like that is not a word that we use anymore. Their melancholy is soothing, and their joy elevating to a degree I never experienced in studying the authors of any other country. When you read their writing, life appears to consist in a warm sun and garden of roses, in the smiles and frowns of a fair enemy, and the fire that consumes your own heart. How different from the manly and heroical poetry of Greece and Rome! Summer passed away in these occupations, and my return to Geneva was fixed for the latter end of autumn, but being delayed by several accidents, winter and snow arrived. The roads were deemed impassable, and my journey was slowed until the ensuing spring. I felt this delay very bitterly, for I longed to see my native town and my beloved friends. My return had only been delayed so long from an unwillingness unwillingness to leave Corval in a strange place before he had become acquainted with any of its inhabitants. The winter, however, was spent cheerfully, and although the spring was uncommonly late when it came, its beauty compensated for its deletorious delatoriness. What? Moving on. The month of May had already commenced, and I expected the letter daily which was to fix the date of my departure, when Henry proposed a pedestrian tour in the environs of Ingolstadt, that I might bid a personal farewell to the country I had so long inhabited. I acceded with pleasure to this proposition. I was fond of exercise, and Clerval had always been my favorite companion in the rambles of this nature that I had taken among the scenes of my native country. We passed a fortnight in these preambulations. My health and spirits had long been restored, and they gained additional strength from the salubrious air I breathed, the natural incidents of our progress, and the conversation of my friends. Study had before secluded me from the intercourse of my fellow creatures and rendered me unsocial. But Clerval called forth the better feelings of my heart. He again taught me to love the aspect of nature and the cheerful faces of children. Excellent friend! How sincerely did you love me and endeavor to elevate my mind until it was on a level with your own. A selfish pursuit had cramped and narrowed me, until your gentleness and affection warmed and opened my senses. I became the same happy creature who, a few years ago, loving and beloved by all, had no sorrow or care. When happy, inanimate nature had the power of bestowing on me the most beautiful sensations. A serene sky and verdant fields filled me with ecstasy. The present season was indeed divine. The flowers of spring bloomed in the hedges, while those of summer were already in bud. I was undisturbed by thoughts which during the preceding year had pressed upon me, notwithstanding my endeavors to throw them off with an invincible burden. Oh, you have a definition. Excellent. Definitions of dilatoriness. Slowness as a consequence of not getting around to it. There we go. Thank you. We're expanding our vocabulary. Will I ever use this word in a sentence? Probably not. Probably not ever. Mary Shelley is just trying to make us smarter. Henry rejoiced in my gaiety and sincerely sympathized in my feeling. He exerted himself to amuse me while he expressed the sensations that filled his soul. The resources of his mind on this occasion were truly astonishing. His conversation was full of imagination, and very often, in imitation of the Persian and Arabic writers, he invented tales of wonderful fancy and passion. At other times he repeated my favorite poems, or drew me out into arguments which he supported with great ingenuity. We returned to our college on a Sunday afternoon. The peasants were dancing, and everyone we met appeared happy. My own spirits were high, and I bounded along with feelings of unbridled joy and hilarity. That is the end of chapter 5. Okay, so this chapter, we read Elizabeth's letter. Elizabeth, our cousin, who is also our sister because Victor's parents adopted her. It's fine. And she's worried about Victor, and also is just like relaying all of the things that are going on at home, which isn't too much, but just like giving updates type of a thing. And she's like, you need to write to us, we're worried about you. So Victor does write, and like what's going on, like updates saying he's fine, all of these sorts of things. Clerval, while being there, has helped Victor sort of get better just by like moving all of his science instruments like out of the way and clearing them, because anytime Victor's around them or looks at them, he like gets uneasy or queasy or whatever. So like Clerval has like made that association, like, oh, his science study is making him feel this way. So he's removed them. We have praises and shouts of triumph from both of Victor's science professors, and it's making Victor super uncomfortable. They are planning on going home for a visit, and yeah, that's pretty much it. So there's still like an uneasiness of, we don't know exactly what's going on with our monster, so to speak, and with the science, and like Victor's uneasiness is translated into his writing. Chapter 6. On my return, I found the following letter from my father. To V. Frankenstein. My dear Victor, you read this like 20 years ago, so you don't remember much, but noticing on this read through that there's a lot of friendship stuff. Yeah, there is a lot of friendship stuff and a lot of like, I don't know, like almost outside the story stuff, if that makes sense. What do you think it'll, yes, yes. What do you think will be to foreshadow contrast with monster stuff coming up? Yes, I agree with you. I think you're totally right. I think you're totally right. You got it right on the nose. To V. Frankenstein. My dear Victor, you have probably waited impatiently for a letter to fix the date of your return to us, and I was at first tempted to write only a few lines, merely mentioning the day on which I should expect you, but that would be a cruel kindness, and I dare not do it. What would be your surprise, my son, when you expected a happy welcome, to behold, on the contrary, tears and wretchedness? And how, Victor, can I relate our misfortune? Absence cannot have rendered you callous to our joys and griefs, and how shall I inflict pain on an absent child? I wish to prepare you for the woeful news, but I know it is impossible. Even now your eye skims over the page to seek the words which are to convey you to the horrible tidings. Yeah, you're totally right. Like the friendship and like the a lot of it does not seem like it will be or is relevant, pertinent to the story, to the action, to the things that are going to move the plot along and get us excited. I totally agree. So I do think that you're right, that it is like a shift. It's supposed to be a shift. And I think you're right with that. Oh no. Okay. William is dead. That sweet child whose smiles delighted and warmed my heart, who was so gentle. Victor, he is murdered. I will not attempt to console you, but will simply relate the circumstances of the transaction. Okay, we got a shift in tone. Cool. Last Thursday, May 7th, I, my niece, and your two brothers went to walk in Plain Palace. The evening was warm and serene, and we prolonged our walk farther than usual. It was already dusk before we thought of returning, and then we discovered that William and Ernest, who had gone on before, were not to be found. We accordingly rested on a seat until they should return. Presently Ernest came and inquired if we had seen his brother. He said that they had been playing together, that William had run away to hide himself, and that he vainly sought for him, and afterwards waited for him a long time, but that he did not return. This account rather alarmed us, and we continued to search for him until night fell, when Elizabeth conjectured that he might have returned to the house. He was not there. We returned again with torches, for I could not rest, when I thought that my sweet boy had lost himself, and was exposed to all the damps and dews of night. Elizabeth also suffered extreme anguish. About 5 in the morning I discovered my lovely boy, whom the night before I had seen blooming and active in health, stretched on the grass, livid and motionless. The print of the murderer's finger was on his neck. He was conveyed home, and the anguish that was visible in my countenance betrayed the secret to Elizabeth. She was very earnest to see the corpse. At first I attempted to prevent her, but she persisted, and entering the room where it lay, hastily examined the neck of the victim, and, clasping her hands, exclaimed, "Oh God, I have murdered my darling infant!" She fainted, and was restored with extreme difficulty. When she again lived, it was only to weep and sigh. She told me that same evening William had teased her to let him wear a very valuable miniature that she possessed of your mother. This picture is gone, and was doubtless the temptation which urged the murderer to the deed. We have no trace of him at present, although our exertions to discover him are unremitted, but they will not restore my beloved William. Come, dearest Victor, you alone can console Elizabeth. She weeps continually, and accuses herself unjustly as the cause of his death. Her words pierce my heart. They are all unhappy, but will not that be an additional motive for you, my son, to return and be our comforter? Your dear mother, alas, Victor, I now say, thank God she did not live to witness the cruel, miserable death of her youngest darling. Come, Victor, not brooding thoughts of vengeance against the assassin, but with feelings of peace and gentleness that will heal instead of festering the wounds of our minds. Enter the house of mourning, my friend, but with kindness and affection for those who love you, and not with hatred for your enemies. Your affectionate and afflicted father, Alphonse Frankenstein. Geneva, May 12th. Okay. Little different than the last letter we received from Elizabeth. So letter from Papa Frankenstein saying, I was just going to tell you a date to come visit, to come home. And that's it in the letter, but you need to know what you're walking into. Your brother is dead. Your brother has been murdered. And then relays the scene that they were all out on a walk. Ernest and William were playing. They like went away to go play. Ernest came back and was like, "Oh, William's not here yet? That's weird. Maybe he already like went home." They all go home and William is not there, and then they find him dead. With fingerprints, like the murderer's fingerprints, like on William's neck. And Elizabeth blames herself because she let William wear something from her aunt's. I don't remember what. And she thinks that is why. That's like what attracted the murderer. So it's fine. It's fine. Clerval, who had watched my countenance as I read this letter, was surprised to observe the despair that succeeded to the joy I at first expressed on receiving news from my friends. That is what I just said. I threw the letter on the table and covered my face with my hands. "My dear Frankenstein," exclaimed Henry, when he perceived me weep with bitterness, "are you always to be unhappy? My dear friend, what has happened?" I motioned to him to take up the letter, while I walked up and down the room in the extremest agitation. Tears also gushed from the eyes of Clerval as he read the account of my misfortune. "I can offer you no consolation, my friend," said he. "Your disaster is irreparable. What do you intend to do?" "To go instantly to Geneva. Come with me, Henry, to order the horses." During our walk, Clerval endeavored to raise my spirits. He did not do this by common topics of consolation, but by exhibiting the truest sympathy. "Poor William," said he. "That dear child, he now sleeps with his angel mother. His friends mourn and weep, but he is at rest. He does not now feel the murderer's grasp. A sod covers his gentle form, and he knows no pain. He can no longer be a fit subject for pity. The survivors are the greatest sufferers, and for them time is the only consolation. Those maxims of the Stoics, that death is no evil, and that the mind of man ought to be superior to despair on the eternal absence of a beloved object, ought not to be urged. Even Cato wept over the dead body of his brother. Clerval spoke thus as we hurried through the streets. The words impressed themselves on my mind, and I remembered them afterwards in solitude. But now, as soon as the horses arrived, I hurried into a cabriole and bade farewell to my friend. My journey was very melancholy. At first I wished to hurry on, for I longed to console and sympathize with my loved and sorrowing friends, but when I drew near my native town, I slackened my progress. I could hardly sustain the multitude of feelings that crowded in my mind. I passed through scenes familiar to my youth, but which I had not seen for nearly 6 years. How altered everything might be during that time. One sudden and desolating change had taken place, but 1,000 little circumstances might have been by degrees worked other alterations which, although they were done more tranquilly, might not be the less decisive. Fear overcame me. I dared not advance, dreading 1,000 nameless evils that made me tremble, though I was unable to define them. I remained 2 days at Lausanne in this painful state of mind. I contemplated the lake. The waters were placid, all around was calm, and the snowy mountains, the palaces of nature, were not changed. By degrees the calm and heavenly scene restored me, and I continued my journey towards Geneva. The road ran by the side of the lake, which came narrower as I approached my native town. I discovered more distinctly the black sides of Jura and the bright summit of Mont Blanc. I wept like a child. Dear mountains, my own beautiful lake, how do you welcome your wanderer? Your summits are clear. The sky and lake are blue and placid. Is this to prognosticate peace, or to mock at my unhappiness? I fear, my friend, that I shall render myself tedious by dwelling on these preliminary circumstances, but they were days of comparable happiness, and I think of them with pleasure. My country, my beloved country, who but a native can tell the delight I took in again beholding thy streams, thy mountains, and, more than all, thy lovely lake? Yet, as I drew nearer home, grief and fear again overcame me. Night also closed round, and when I could hardly see the dark mountains, I felt still more gloomily. The picture appeared a vast and dim scene of evil, and I foresaw obscurely that I was destined to become the most wretched of human beings. Alas, I prophesied truly and failed only in one single circumstance, that in all the misery I imagined and dreaded, I did not conceive the 100th part of the anguish I was destined to endure. It was completely dark when I arrived in the environs of Geneva. The gates of the town were already shut, and I was obliged to pass the night at Secaran, a village half a league to the east of the city. The sky was serene, and, as I was unable to rest, I resolved to visit the spot where my poor William had been murdered. As I could not pass through the town, I was obliged to cross the lake in a boat to arrive at Plain Palace. During this short voyage I saw the lightnings playing on the summit of Mont Blanc in the most beautiful figures. The storm appeared to approach rapidly, and, on landing, I ascended a low hill that I might observe its progress. It advanced, the heavens were clouded, and I soon felt the rain coming slowly in large drops, but its violence quickly increased. I quitted my seat and walked on, although the darkness and storm increased every minute, and the thunder burst with a terrific crash over my head. It was echoed from Salève. the Juras, and the Alps of Savoy. Vivid flashes of lightning dazzled my eyes, illuminating the lake, making it appear like a vast sheet of fire. Then, for an instant, everything seemed of a pitchy darkness, until the eye recovered itself from the preceding flash. The storm, as is often the case in Switzerland, appeared at once in various parts of the heavens. The most violent storm hung exactly north of the town, over that part of the lake which lies between the promontory of Belrive and the village of Coppet. Another storm enlightened Jura with faint flashes, and another darkened and sometimes disclosed the Mole, a peaked mountain to the east of the lake. While I watched the storm, so beautiful yet terrific, I wandered on with a hasty step. This noble war in the sky elevated my spirits. I clasped my hands and exclaimed aloud, "William, dear angel, this is thy funeral. This is thy dirge." As I said these words, I perceived in the gloom a figure which stole from behind a clump of trees near me. I stood fixed, gazing intently. I could not be mistaken. A flash of lightning illuminated the object, and discovered its shape plainly to me, its gigantic stature and the deformity of its aspect, more hideous than belongs to humanity, instantly informed me that it was the wretch, the filthy demon to whom I had given life. What did he there? Could he be, I shuddered at the conception, the murderer of my brother? No sooner did that idea cross my imagination than I became convinced of its truth. My teeth chattered, and I was forced to lean against a tree for support. The figure passed me quickly, and I lost it in the gloom. Nothing in human shape could have destroyed that fair child. He was the murderer. I could not doubt it. The mere presence of the idea was an irresistible proof of the fact. I thought of pursuing the devil, but it would have been in vain, for another flash discovered him to me hanging among the rocks of the nearby perpendicular ascent of Mont Saleve, a hill that bounds Plain Palais on the south. He soon reached the summit and disappeared. All of these places, proper nouns, I have such a hard time saying. I remained motionless. The thunder ceased, but the rain still continued, and the scene was enveloped in an impenetrable darkness. I resolved in my mind the events which I had until now sought to forget. The whole train of my progress towards the creation, the appearance of the work of my own hands alive at my bedside, its departure. I remained motionless. The thunder ceased, but the rain still continued, and the scene was enveloped in an impenetrable darkness. I revolved in my mind the events which I had until now sought to forget. The whole train of my progress towards the creation, the appearance of the work of my own hands alive at my bedside, its departure. 2 years had now nearly elapsed since the night on which he first received life, and was this his first crime? Alas, I had turned loose into the world a depraved wretch whose delight was in carnage and misery. Had he not murdered my brother? No one can conceive the anguish I suffered during the remainder of the night, which I spent, cold and wet, in the open air. But I did not feel the inconvenience of the weather. My imagination was busy in scenes of evil and despair. I considered the being whom I had cast among mankind, and endowed with the will and power to effect purposes of horror, such as the deed which he had now done, nearly in the light of my own vampire, my own spirit let loose from the grave, and forced to destroy all that was dear to me. Day dawned, and I directed my steps towards the town. The gates were open, and I hastened to my father's house. My first thought was to discover what I knew of the murderer, and cause instant pursuit to be made. But I paused when I reflected on the story that I had to tell. a being whom I myself had formed and endued with life, had met me at midnight among the precipices of an inaccessible mountain. I remembered also the nervous fever with which I had been seized just at the time that I dated my creation, and which would give an air of delirium to a tale otherwise so utterly improbable. I well knew that if any other had communicated such a relation to me, I should have looked upon it as the ravings of insanity. Besides, besides, the strange nature of the animal would elude all pursuit, even if I were so far credited as to persuade my relatives to commence it. Besides, of what use would be pursuit? Who could arrest a creature capable of scaling the overhanging sides of Mount Saleve? These reflections determined me, and I resolved to remain silent. It was about 5 in the morning when I entered my father's house. I told the servants not to disturb the family, and went into the library to attend their usual hour of rising. There's a murder monster on the loose, you say? That's weird. I know nothing about this, and I have no idea how that could have happened. Hmm. 6 years had elapsed, passed as a dream, but for one indelible trace, and I stood in the same place where I had last embraced my father before my departure for Ingolstadt. Beloved and respectable parent, he still remained to me. I gazed on the picture of my mother, which stood over the mantelpiece. It was a historical subject, painted at my father's desire, and represented Caroline Beaufort in an agony of despair, kneeling by the coffin of her dead father. Her garb was rustic, and her cheek pale, but there was an air of dignity and beauty that hardly permitted the sentiment of pity. Below this picture was a miniature of William, and my tears flowed when I looked upon it. While I was thus engaged, Ernest entered. He had heard me arrive, and hastened to welcome me. He expressed a sorrowful delight to see me. "Welcome, my dearest Victor," said he. "Ah, I wish you had come 3 months ago, and then you would have found us all joyous and delighted. But we are now unhappy, and, I am afraid, tears instead of smiles will be your welcome. Your father looks so sorrowful. This dreadful event seems to have revived in his mind his grief on the death of mamma. Poor Elizabeth also is quite inconsolable." Ernest began to weep as he said these words. "Do not," said I, "welcome me thus. Try to be more calm, that I may not be absolutely miserable the moment I enter my father's house, after so long an absence. But, tell me, how does my father support his misfortunes, and how is my Elizabeth?" Okay, did he just say, like, don't welcome me with sadness because I don't want to be sad as soon as I step into this house, even though my younger brother died, probably from the monster I created? Just checking. Just checking. She indeed requires consolation. She accused herself of having caused the death of my brother, and that made her very wretched. But since the murderer had been discovered— The murderer discovered? Good God, how can that be? Who could attempt to pursue him? It is impossible. One might as well try to overtake the winds, or confine a mountain stream with a straw. I I do not know what you mean. But we were all very unhappy when she was discovered. No one would believe it at first, and even now Elizabeth will not be convinced, notwithstanding all the evidence. Indeed, who could credit that Justine Moritz, who was so amiable and fond of all the family, could all at once become so extremely wicked? Justine? Justine. The happy-go-lucky girl that Elizabeth just wrote to us about. She's the one? She's the one who killed little William? What? Justine Moritz. Poor, poor girl. Is she the accused? But it is wrongfully. Everyone knows that. No one believes it, surely, Ernest. No one did at first, but several circumstances came out that have almost forced conviction upon us, and her own behavior has been so confused as to add to the evidence of facts as a weight that, I fear, leaves no hope for doubt. But she will be tried today, and you will then hear all. He related that, the morning on which the murder of poor William had been discovered, Justine had been taken ill, and confined to her bed, and, after several days, one of the servants, happening to examine the apparel she had worn on the night of the murder, had discovered in her pocket the picture of my mother, which had been judged to be the temptation of the murderer. The servant instantly shewed it to one of the others, who, without saying a word to any of the family, went to a magistrate, and, upon their disposition, Justine was apprehended. On being charged with the fact, the poor girl confirmed the suspicion in a great measure by her extreme confusion of manner. This was a strange tale, but it did not shake my faith, and I replied earnestly, "You are all mistaken. I know the murderer. Justine, poor, good Justine, is innocent." So now we're bragging that we know the murderer. At that instant my father entered. I saw unhappiness deeply impressed on his countenance, but he endeavored to welcome me cheerfully, and, after we had exchanged our mournful greeting, would have introduced some other topic than that of our disaster, had not Ernest proclaimed, "Good God, papa, Victor says that he knows who was the murderer of poor William." "We do also, unfortunately," replied my father, "for, indeed, I had rather have been for ever ignorant than have discovered so much depravity and ingratitude in one I valued so highly." "My dear father, you are mistaken. Justine is innocent." "If she is, God forbid that she should suffer as guilty. She is to be tried today, and I sincerely hope, that she will be acquitted." This speech calmed me. I was firmly convinced in my own mind that Justine, and indeed every human being, was guiltless of this murder. I had no fear, therefore, that any circumstantial evidence could be brought forward strong enough to convict her, and, in this assurance, I calmed myself, expecting the trial with eagerness, but without prognosticating an evil result. We were soon joined by Elizabeth. Time had made great alterations in her form since I had last beheld her. 6 years before she had been a pretty, good-humoured girl, whom everyone loved and caressed. She was now a woman in stature and expression of countenance, which was uncommonly lovely. An open and capacious forehead gave indications of a good understanding, joined to great frankness of disposition. Her eyes were hazel and expressive of mildness, now through recent affliction allied to sadness. Her hair was of a rich, dark auburn, her complexion fair, and her figure slight and graceful. She welcomed me with the greatest affection. "Your arrival, my dear cousin," said she, "fills me with hope. You, perhaps, will find some means to justify my poor guiltless Justine. Alas! Who is safe if she can be convicted of crime? I rely on her innocence as certainly as I do upon my own. Our misfortune is doubly hard to us. We have not only lost that lovely darling boy, but this poor girl, whom I sincerely love, is to be torn away by even a worse fate. If she is condemned, I never shall know joy more. But she will not, I am sure she will not, and then I shall be happy again, even after the sad death of my little William." Okay, can we take a pause? Because Elizabeth just said that she is sure that she is innocent, just as she is sure that she herself is innocent of this crime. But, my dear friends, not several pages ago, Elizabeth was distraught because she blamed herself for the murder. So which is it, Elizabeth? Do you think Justine is innocent, or do you think she's guilty? You're confusing all of us. Look, she is innocent, my Elizabeth, said I, and that shall be proved. Fear nothing, but let your spirits be cheered by the assurance of her acquittal. How kind you are! Everyone else believes in her guilt, and that made me wretched, for I know that it was impossible, and to see everyone else prejudiced in so deadly a manner rendered me hopeless and despairing. She wept. Sweet niece, said my father, dry your tears. If she is, as you believe, innocent, rely on the justice of our judges, and the activity with which I shall prevent the slightest shadow of partiality. End of chapter 6. Okay, so, cool. You can feel guilt and not, okay, fine. Yes, you're right. You can feel guilt and not be guilty. Okay, so we get word from Papa Frankenstein, Papa, if you will, and that William has died. So immediately, Victor's like, well, I have to go home. So he goes back home. It's been 6 years since he last left. He goes back home and he's like, well, I know who did it. It was my monster, obviously. But I'm going to pretend like it's not my monster, but it was definitely my monster. And then he finds out from his brother that Justine, lovely little Justine, is the one who has been convicted of William's murder. And Victor's like, don't be dumb. Justine is innocent. I know who did the murder, and it definitely wasn't Justine. And everybody's like, yeah, it was Justine. It was definitely her. She became very ill, but it was definitely her. And that's where we are. And there's going to be a trial. So Justine's going to be on trial for the murder of William, and we'll see what happens with this. Bum, bum, bum. Chapter 7. We passed a few sad hours until 11 o'clock, when the trial was to commence. My father had and the rest of the family being obliged to attend as witnesses, I accompanied them to the court. During the whole of this wretched mockery of justice, I suffered living torture. It was to be decided whether the result of my curiosity and lawless devices would cause the death of two of my fellow beings, one of smiling babe, full of innocence and joy, the other far more dreadfully murdered, with every aggravation of infamy that could make the murder memorable in horror. Justine also was a girl of merit, and possessed qualities which promised to render her happy life. Now all was to be obliterated in an ignominious grave, and I the cause. 1,000 times rather would I have confessed myself guilty of the crime ascribed to Justine, but I was absent when it was committed, and such declaration would have been considered as the ravings of a madman, and would not have exculpated her who suffered through me. The appearance of Justine was calm. She was dressed in mourning, and her countenance, always engaged, was rendered, by the solemnity of her feelings, exquisitely beautiful. Yet she appeared confident in innocence, and did not tremble, although gazed on and execrated by thousands, for all the kindness which her beauty might otherwise have excited was obliterated in the minds of the spectators by the imagination of the enormity she was supposed to have committed. She was tranquil, yet her tranquillity was evidently constrained, and as her confusion had before been adduced as a proof of her guilt, she worked up her mind to an appearance of courage. When she entered the court, she threw her eyes round it, and quickly discovered where we were seated. A tear seemed to dim her eye when she saw us, but she quickly recovered herself, and a look of sorrowful affection seemed to attest her utter guiltlessness. The trial began. and after the advocate against her had stated the charge, several witnesses were called. Several strange facts combined against her, which might have staggered anyone who had not such proof of her innocence as I had. She had been out the whole of the night on which the murder had been committed, and towards morning had been perceived by a market woman not far from the spot where the body of the murdered child had been afterwards found. The woman asked her what she did there, but she looked very strangely, and only returned a confused and unintelligible answer. She returned to the house about 8 o'clock, and when one inquired where she had passed the night, she replied that she had been looking for the child, and demanded earnestly if anything had been heard concerning him. When showed the body, she fell into violent hysterics, and kept her bed for several days. The picture was then produced, which the servant had found in her pocket, and when Elizabeth, in a faltering voice, proved that it was the same which, an hour before the child had been missed, she had placed round his neck, a murmur of horror and indignation filled the court. Justine was called on for her defense. As the trial had proceeded, her countenance had altered. Surprise, horror, and misery were strongly expressed. Sometimes she struggled with her tears, but when she was desired to plead, she collected her powers, and spoke in an audible, although variable voice. "God knows," she said, "how entirely I am innocent, but I do not pretend that my protestations should acquit me. I rest my innocence on a plain and simple explanation of the facts which have been adduced against me, and I hope the character I have always borne will incline my judges to a favorable interpretation where any circumstance appears doubtful or suspicious." She then related that, by the permission of Elizabeth, she had passed the evening of the night on which the murder had been committed at the house of an aunt, in a village situated at about a league from Geneva. On her return, at about 9 o'clock, she met a man, who asked her if she had seen anything of the child who was lost. She was alarmed by this account, and passed several hours in looking for him. When the gates of Geneva were shut, and she was forced to remain several hours of the night in a barn belonging to a cottage, being unwilling to call up the inhabitants, to whom she was well known. Unable to rest or sleep, she quitted her asylum early, that she might again endeavor to find my brother. If she had gone near the spot where his body lay, it was without her knowledge. That she had been bewildered when questioned by the market woman was not surprising, since she had passed a sleepless night, and the fate of poor William was yet uncertain. Concerning the picture she could give no account. "I know," continued the unhappy victim, "how heavily and fatally this one circumstance weighs against me, but I have no power of explaining it, and when I have expressed my utter ignorance, I am only left to conjecture concerning the probabilities by which it might have been placed in my pocket. But here also I am checked. I believe that I have no enemy on earth, and none surely would have been so wicked as to destroy me wantonly. Did the murderer place it there? I know of no opportunity afforded him for so doing, or if I had, why should he have stolen the jewel, to part with it again so soon? I commit my cause to the justice of my judges, yet I see no room for hope. I beg permission to have a few witnesses examined concerning my character, and if their testimony shall not overweigh my supposed guilt, I must be condemned, although I would pledge my salvation on my innocence." Several witnesses were called, who had known her for many years, and they spoke well of her, but fear and hatred of the crime of which they supposed her guilty rendered them timorous and unwilling to come forward. Elizabeth saw even this last resort, her excellent dispositions and irreproachable conduct, about to fail the accused when, although violently agitated, she desired permission to address the court. "I am," she said, "the cousin of the unhappy child who was murdered, or rather his sister, for I was educated by and have lived with his parents ever since, and even long before his birth. It may therefore be judged indecent in me to come forward on this occasion. But when I see a fellow creature about to perish through the cowardice of her pretended friends, I wish to be allowed to speak that I may say what I know of her character. I have lived in the same house with her, at one time for 5, and another time for 2 years. During all that period she appeared to me the most amiable and benevolent of human creatures. She nursed Madame Frankenstein, my aunt, in her last illness with the greatest affection and care, and afterwards attended her, my own mother, during a tedious illness, in a manner that excited the admiration of all who knew her. After which she again lived in my uncle's house, where she was beloved by all the family. She was warmly attached to the child who is now dead, and acted towards him like a most affectionate mother. For my own part, I do not hesitate to say that, notwithstanding all the evidence produced against her, I believe and rely on her perfect innocence. She had no temptation for such an action. As to the bauble on which the chief proof rests, if she had earnestly desired it, I should have willingly given it to her. So much do I esteem and value her. Excellent, Elizabeth. A murmur of approbation was heard, but it was excited by her generous interference, and not in favor of poor Justine, on whom the public indignation was turned and renewed violence, charging her with the blackest ingratitude. She herself wept as Elizabeth spoke, but she did not answer. My own agitation and anguish was extreme during the whole trial. I believed in her innocence. I knew it. Could the demon who had, I did not for a minute doubt, murdered my brother, also in his hellish sport have betrayed the innocent to death and ignominy? I could not sustain the horror of my situation, and when I perceived that the popular voice and the countenances of the judges had already condemned my unhappy victim, I rushed out of the court in agony. The tortures of the accused did not equal mine. She was sustained by innocence, but the fangs of remorse tore my bosom, and would not forego their hold. I passed a night of unmingled wretchedness. In the morning I went to the court. I dared not ask the fatal question, but I was known, and the officer guessed the cause of my visit. The ballots had been thrown. They were all black, and Justine was condemned. I cannot predict to describe what I then felt. I had before experienced sensations of horror, and I have endeavored to bestow upon them adequate expressions. But words cannot convey an idea of the heart-sickening despair that I then endured. The person to whom I addressed myself added that Justine had already confessed her guilt. "That evidence," he observed, "was hardly required in so glaring a case, but I am glad of it, and indeed none of our judges like to condemn a criminal upon circumstantial evidence, be it ever so decisive." When I returned home, Elizabeth eagerly demanded the result. "My cousin," replied I, "it is decided as you may have expected. All judges had rather that 10 innocent should suffer than that 1 guilty should escape. But she has confessed." This was a dire blow to poor Elizabeth, who had relied with firmness upon Justine's innocence. "Alas!" said she, "how shall I ever again believe in human benevolence? Justine, whom I loved and esteemed as my sister, how could she put on those smiles of innocence only to betray? Her mild eyes seemed incapable of any severity or ill humor, and yet she has committed a murder." Soon after, we heard that the poor victim had expressed a wish to see my cousin. My father wished her not to go, but said that he left it to her own judgment and feelings to decide. "Yes," said Elizabeth, "I will go, although she is guilty, and you, Victor, shall accompany me. I cannot go alone." The idea of this visit was torture to me, yet I could not refuse. We entered the gloomy prison chamber and beheld Justine sitting on some straw at the further end. Her hands were manacled, manacled, and her head rested on her knees. She rose on seeing us enter, and when we were left alone with her, she threw herself at the feet of Elizabeth, weeping bitterly. My cousin wept also. "Oh, Justine," said she, "why did you rob me of my last consolation? I relied on your innocence, and although I was then very wretched, I was not so miserable as I am now." "And do you also believe that I am so very, very wicked? Do you also join with my victims to crush me?" Her voice was suffocated with sobs. "Rise, my poor girl," said Elizabeth. "Why do you kneel, if you are innocent? I am not one of your enemies. I believed you guiltless, notwithstanding every evidence, until I heard that you had yourself declared your guilt. That report, you say, is false. And be assured, dear Justine, that nothing can shake my confidence in you for a moment but your own confession." Justine confessed only after 44 hours of torture. Yes. That's what it like seems like. Like they weren't going to um like prosecute her. And then she's like, "It was me. I did it." Which seems an odd choice, but there you have it. Yeah. I don't know why she like had this sudden change. Maybe because it like didn't make sense like her story and like everybody already thought she did it. I don't know. Oh, okay. Maybe if I had just continued reading on literally in the first sentence. Oopsie poopsie. I did confess, but I confessed a lie. I confessed that I might obtain absolution. But now that falsehood lies heavier at my heart than all my other sins. The God of heaven forgive me. Ever since I was condemned, my confessor has besieged me. He threatened and menaced until I almost began to think that I was the monster that he said I was. He threatened excommunication and hellfire in my last moments, if I continued obdurate. Dear lady, I had none to support me. All looked on me as a wretch doomed to ignominy and perdition. What could I do? In an evil hour I subscribed to a lie, and now only am I truly miserable. She paused, weeping, and then continued. I thought with horror, my sweet lady, that you should believe your Justine, whom your blessed aunt had so highly honored, and whom you loved, was a creature capable of a crime which none but the devil himself could have perpetrated. Dear William, dearest, blessed child, I soon shall see you again in heaven, where we shall all be happy, and that consoles me, going as I am to suffer ignominy and death. Oh, Justine, forgive me for having for one moment distrusted you. Why did you confess? But do not mourn, my dear girl. I will everywhere proclaim your innocence and force belief. Yet you must die, you, my playfellow, my companion, my more than sister. I never can survive so horrible a misfortune. Dear, sweet Elizabeth, do not weep. You ought to raise me with thoughts of a better life, and elevate me from the petty cares of this world of injustice and strife. Do not you, excellent friend, drive me to despair. I will try to comfort you, but this, I fear, is an evil too deep and poignant to admit of consolation, for there is no hope. Yet heaven bless thee, my dear Justine, with resignation and a confidence elevated beyond this world. Oh, how I hate its shows and mockeries! When one creature is murdered, another is immediately deprived of life in a slow, torturing manner. Then the executioners, their hands yet reeking with the blood of innocents, believing that they have done a great deal, they call this retribution. Hateful name. When that word is pronounced, I know greater and more horrid punishments are going to be inflicted than the gloomiest tyrant has ever invented to satiate his utmost revenge. Yet this is not consolation for you, my Justine, unless indeed that you may glory in escaping from so miserable a den. Alas, I would I were in peace with my aunt and my lovely William, escaped from a world which is hateful to me, and the visages of men which I abhor. Justine smiled languidly. This, dear lady, is despair and not resignation. I must not learn the lesson that you would teach me. Talk of something else, something that will bring peace and not increase of misery. During this conversation, I had retired to a corner of the prison room, where I could conceal the horrid anguish that possessed me. Despair. Who dared talk of that? The poor victim, who on the morrow was to pass the dreary boundary between life and death, felt not as I did, such deep and bitter agony. I gnashed my teeth and ground them together, uttering a groan that came from my innermost soul. Justine started. When she saw who it was, she approached me and said, "Dear sir, you are very kind to visit me. You, I hope, do not believe that I am guilty." I could not answer. "No, Justine," answered Elizabeth. "He is more convinced of your innocence than I was, for even when he heard that you had confessed, he did not credit it." I truly thank him. In these last moments, I feel the sincerest gratitude towards those who think of me with kindness. How sweet is the affection of others to such a wretch as I am! It removes more than half my misfortune, and I feel as if I could die in peace, now that my innocence is acknowledged by you, dear lady, and your cousin. Thus the poor sufferer tried to comfort others and herself. She indeed gained the resignation she desired, but I, the true murderer, felt the never-dying worm alive in my bosom, which allowed of no hope or consolation. Elizabeth also wept, and was unhappy, but hers also was the misery of innocence which, like a cloud that passes over the fair moon, for a while hides, but cannot tarnish its brightness. Anguish and despair had penetrated into the core of my heart. I bore a hell within me, which nothing could extinguish. We stayed several hours with Justine, and it was with great difficulty that Elizabeth could tear herself away. "I wish," cried she, "that I were to die with you. I cannot live in this world of misery." Justine assumed an air of cheerfulness, while she with difficulty repressed her bitter tears. She embraced Elizabeth, and said, in a voice of half-suppressed emotion, "Farewell, sweet lady, dearest Elizabeth, my beloved and only friend. May heaven in its bounty bless and preserve you. May this be the last misfortune that you will ever suffer. Live and be happy, and make others so." As we returned, Elizabeth said, "You know not, my dear Victor, how much I am relieved, now that I trust in the innocence of this unfortunate girl. I never could again have known peace, if I had been deceived in my reliance on her. For the moment that I did believe her guilty, I felt an anguish that I could not have long sustained. Now my heart is lightened. The innocence suffers, but she whom I thought amiable and good has not betrayed the trust I reposed in her, and I am consoled." Amiable cousin, such were your thoughts, mild and gentle as your own dear eyes and voice, but I was a wretch, and none ever conceived of the misery that I then endured. End of Volume 1. Okay, so my hair keeps getting stuck on this microphone. So, our dear friend Moritz is on trial. Justine Moritz is on trial for the murder of sweet baby William. Well, he's not really a baby, but innocent child William. And she Elizabeth believes she's innocent. Victor knows that she's innocent. And so she's on trial. They're doing all these things. It seems like they cannot convict Justine because there's no actual evidence. Everything is circumstantial. It's like his word versus her word. Elizabeth, or not Elizabeth, Justine says that she was out, and then they were like, well, where were you? And she like recounted what she was doing throughout the night, and she had only heard that a boy was missing, not even who, but a boy was missing in the morning, and she was like looking for him. And then she came home with it. She doesn't know how the picture of Victor's mom got in her pocket. She has no idea. And she doesn't know who the actual murderer is. Um, Whereas the other side, they're saying, well, she was out all night, so she obviously murdered this child and took the picture. There's no real like motive as to why that would be though. So it seems like they're not going to convict her. And then later, like Victor hears that yes, they are. It was unanimous. Every juror thought that she was guilty. And he's like, but why? Like, how could this be? Like, there was no evidence. And it turns out that Justine actually admitted that she did do it, that she did the deed, she did the crime, she did the murder. So Elizabeth is super distraught because how could her friend have betrayed her? How could her friend have said that she didn't murder William and then actually did it? Like, she just doesn't believe it. So she's like, I must go see Justine. So she goes there with Victor. She's like, you must come with me. And Justine says, yeah, I said that I did it, but like, I didn't. I only said it so that I could be absolved from this and like have a peaceful and happier life, but it's just not the case at all. And it's actually gotten worse, and people hate her, is the thing. But Elizabeth is like, oh, but I still trust you, and I will spread the word of your innocence and all of these other things. And Victor is like, of course she's innocent. Duh. But that's where we ended the first part. Why else would one be out at night if not for murder? True. True. Murder. Oh, sorry. Had to clear my throat. I assumed if I had confessed that they'd all let me go and everyone would be nice to me. Weird how that didn't happen and how people like put me in prison and I'm gonna die here, and isn't that odd? You silly little girl. Silly. Frankenstein, or Modern Prometheus in 3 volumes. Volume 2. Did I request thee, Maker, from my clay, to mold me man? Did I solicit thee from darkness to promote me? Paradise Lost. Part 2, Chapter 1. I wish that even when we go to a next part, we don't like go back to chapter 1. You know, we did all that work to get to where we were. Can we not continue? Now it seems like we have made no progress because we're on chapter 1. It's fine. Part 2, chapter 1. Nothing is more painful to the human mind than, after the feelings have been worked up by a quick succession of events, the dead calmness of inaction and certainty which follows, and deprives the soul both of hope and fear. Justine died. She rested, and I was alive. The blood flowed freely in my veins, but a weight of despair and remorse pressed on my heart, which nothing could remove. Sleep fled from my eyes. I wandered like an evil spirit, for I had committed deeds of mischief beyond description, horrible, and more, much more, I persuaded myself, was yet behind. Yet my heart overflowed with kindness and the love of virtue. I had begun life with benevolent intentions, and thirsted for the moment when I should put them in practice, and made myself useful to my fellow beings. Now all was blasted. Instead of that serenity of conscience which allowed me to look back upon the past with self-satisfaction, and from thence to gather promise of new hope, I was seized by remorse and the sense of guilt, which hurried me away to a hell of intense tortures such as no language can describe. Wow, so they just went right ahead and killed her. And he's just sitting there, guilty. I wonder if before Justine died, she had like a whole musical number about how she was innocent, along with however many it was. Was it 6? Was it 7? In Murderous Row. This is supposed to be a Chicago the Musical reference, and I'm struggling. So just pretend that I pulled it off and you're all very impressed. It became too much work and it was just meandering. I had to move on. This state of mind preyed upon my health, which had entirely recovered from the first shock it had sustained. I shunned the face of man. All round of joy and or complacency was torture to me. Solitude was my only consolation. Deep, dark, death-like solitude. My father observed with pain the alteration perceptible in my disposition and habits, and endeavored to reason with me on the folly of giving way to immoderate grief. Immoderate grief. Did we know that we could only grieve moderately? All right. Do you think, Victor, said he, that I do not suffer also? No one could love a child more than I loved your brother. Tears came into his eyes as he spoke. But is it not a duty to the survivors that we should refrain from augmenting their unhappiness by an appearance of immoderate grief? It is also a duty owed to yourself, for excessive sorrow prevents improvement or enjoyment, or even the discharge of daily usefulness, without which no man is fit for society. This advice, although good, was totally inapplicable to my case. I should have been the first to hide my grief and console my friends, if remorse had not mingled its bitterness with my other sensations. Now I could only answer my father with a look of despair and endeavor to hide myself from his view. About this time we retired to our house at Belrive. This change was particularly agreeable to me. The shutting of the gates regularly at 10 o'clock and the impossibility of remaining on the lake after that hour had rendered our residence within the walls of Geneva very irksome to me. I was now free. Often, after the rest of the family had retired for the night, I took the boat and passed many hours upon the water. Sometimes, with my sails set, I was carried by the wind, and sometimes, after rowing into the middle of the lake, I left the boat to pursue its own course, and gave way to my own miserable reflections. I was often tempted, when all was at peace around me, and I the only unquiet thing that wandered restless in a scene so beautiful and heavenly, if I except some bat, or the frogs, whose harsh and interrupted croaking was heard only when I approached the shore. Often, I say, I was tempted to plunge into the silent lake, that the waters might close over me and my calamities forever. But I was restrained, when I thought of the heroic and suffering Elizabeth, whom I tenderly loved, and whose existence was bound up in mine. I thought also of my father and surviving brother. Should I, by my base desertion, leave them exposed and unprotected to the malice of the fiend whom I had let loose among them? At these moments I wept bitterly, and so wished that peace would revisit my mind only that I might afford them consolation and happiness. But that could not be. Remorse extinguished every hope. I had been the author of unalterable evils, and I lived in daily fear lest the monster whom I had created should perpetrate some new wickedness. I had an obscure feeling that I was about to sneeze. Excuse me. I had an obscure feeling that all was not over, and that he would still commit some signal crime, which by its enormity should almost efface the recollection of the past. There was always scope for fear, so long as anything I loved remained behind. My abhorrence for this fiend cannot be conceived. When I thought of him, I gnashed my teeth, my eyes became inflamed, and I ardently wished to extinguish that life which I had so thoughtlessly bestowed. When I reflected on his crimes and malice, my hatred and revenge burst all bounds of moderation. I would have made a pilgrimage to the highest peak of the Andes, could I, when there, have precipitated him to their base. I wished to see him again, that I might wreak the utmost extent of anger on his head, and avenge the deaths of William and Justine. Our house was the house of mourning. My father's health was deeply shaken by the horror of the recent events. Elizabeth was sad and desponding. She no longer took delight in her ordinary occupations. All pleasure seemed to her sacrilege toward the dead. Eternal woe and tears, she then thought, was the just tribute she should pay to innocence so blasted and destroyed. She was no longer that happy creature who in earlier youth wandered with me on the banks of the lake and talked with ecstasy of our future prospects. She had become grave, and often conversed in the inconstancy of fortune and the instability of human life. "When I reflect, my dear cousin," said she, "on the miserable death of Justine Moritz, I no longer see the world and its works as they before appeared to me. Before I looked upon the accounts of vice and injustice that I read in books or heard from others as tales of ancient days or imaginary evils. At least they were remote and more familiar to reason than to the imagination. But now misery has come home, and men appear to me as monsters thirsting for each other's blood. Yet I am certainly unjust. Everybody believed that poor girl to be guilty, and if she could have committed the crime for which she suffered, assuredly she would have been the most depraved of human creatures, for the sake of a few jewels to have murdered the son of her benefactor and friend, a child whom she had nursed from its birth and appeared to love as if it had been her own. I could not consent to the death of any human being, but certainly I should have thought such a creature unfit to remain in the society of men. Yet she was innocent. I know, I feel she was innocent. You are of the same opinion, and that confirms me. Alas, Victor, when falsehood can look so like the truth, who can assure themselves of certain happiness? I feel as if I were walking on the edge of a precipice, towards which thousands are crowding and endeavoring to plunge me into the abyss. William and Justine were assassinated, and the murderer escapes. He walks about the world free and perhaps respected, but even if I were condemned to suffer on the scaffold for the same crimes, I would not change places with such a wretch. I listened to this discourse with the extremest agony. I, not indeed, but in effect, was the true murderer. Elizabeth read my anguish in my countenance, and kindly taking my hand, said, "My dearest cousin, you must calm yourself. These events have affected me, God knows how deeply, but I am not so wretched as you are. There is an expression of despair and sometimes of revenge in your countenance that makes me tremble. Be calm, my dear Victor. I would sacrifice my life to your peace. We surely shall be happy, quiet in our native country and not mingling in the world. What can disturb our tranquillity?" She shed tears as she said this, distrusting the very solace that she gave. But at the same time she smiled, that she might chase away the fiend that lurked in my heart. My father, who saw in the unhappiness that was painted in my face only an exaggeration of that sorrow which I might naturally feel, thought that an amusement suited to my taste would be the best means of restoring to me my wonted serenity. It was from this cause that he had removed to the country, and, induced by the same motive, he now proposed that we should all make an excursion to the valley of Chamonix. Chamonix. That is absolutely not how you pronounce it. Chamonix? Chamonix. I'm getting farther and farther away. Chamonix. Thank you. I was actually almost close with that last one. Thank you for the pronunciation. Chamonix. Make an excursion to the valley of Chamonix. I had been there before, but Elizabeth and Ernest never had, and both had often expressed an earnest desire to see the serenity of this place, which had been described to them as so wonderful and sublime. Accordingly, we departed from Geneva on this tour about the middle of the month of August, nearly 2 months after the death of Justine. The weather was uncommonly fine, and if fine had been a sorrow to be chased away by any fleeting circumstance, this excursion would certainly have had the effect intended by my father. As it was, I was somewhat interested in the scene. It sometimes lulled, although it could not extinguish my grief. During the first day we traveled in a carriage. In the morning we had seen the mountains at a distance, towards which we gradually advanced. We perceived that the valley through which we wound, and which was formed by the river Arve, whose course we followed, closed in upon us by degrees, and when the sun had set, we beheld immense mountains and precipices overhanging us on every side, and heard the sound of the river raging among rocks, and the dashing of waterfalls around. The next day we pursued our journey upon mules, and as we ascended still higher, the valley assumed a more magnificent and astonishing character. Ruined castles hanging on the precipices of piny mountains, the impetuous Arve, and cottages every here and there peeping forth from among the trees, formed a scene of singular beauty. But it was augmented and rendered sublime by the mighty Alps, whose white and shining pyramids and domes towered above all, as belonging to another earth, the habitations of another race of beings. Are we on other Earth? Is this like the time that we went to other Earth, like in Star Maker? We're getting all sorts of crossovers in this book. We passed the bridge of Pelissier, where the ravine which the river forms opened before us, and we began to ascend the mountain that overhangs it. Soon after we entered the valley of Chamonix. This valley is more wonderful and sublime, but not so beautiful and picturesque as that of Cerveau, through which we had just passed. The high and snowy mountains were its immediate boundaries, but we saw no more ruined castles and fertile fields. Immense glaciers approached the road. We heard the rumbling thunder of the falling avalanche, and the marked in smoke of its passage. Mont Blanc, the supreme and magnificent Mont Blanc, raised itself from the surrounding... Oh my gosh. When they throw in other languages, they're just trying to be way fancier. They're just trying to be a little too fancy. Agiles? and its tremendous dome overlooked the valley. Okay, why is dome in parentheses? That is in English. I can't tell you. During this journey, I sometimes joined Elizabeth and exerted myself to point out to her the various beauties of the scene. I often suffered my mule to lag behind and indulged in the misery of reflection. At other times, I spurred on the animal before my companions that I might forget them, the world, and, more than all, myself. When at a distance I alighted and threw myself on the grass, weighed down by horror and despair. At 8 in the evening I arrived at Chamonix. My father and Elizabeth were very much fatigued. Ernest, who accompanied us, was delighted and in high spirits. The only circumstance that detracted from his pleasure was the south wind, and the rain it seemed to promise for the day. We retired early to our apartments, but not to sleep. At least, I did not. I remained many hours at the window, watching the pallid lightning that played above Mont Blanc and listening to the rushing of the Arve, which ran below my window. End of chapter 1. Okay. Part 2, chapter 1. Justine is dead. Sad. Obviously Victor is extremely distraught. Like, everybody's sad. Elizabeth is sad because she knows that she was innocent. Justine did not actually commit the murder. She just said that she did, thinking that, like, she would just be absolved from these things. No idea why. But Victor is also taking it extremely hard because he knows that Justine was innocent and he really strongly thinks that his monster is the one who killed his brother. And, like, his dad is like, dude, you need to not be so grieving, in moderation. You're, like, harshing my vibe. And Elizabeth sort of said the same thing too, and so, like, Papa Frankenstein decided a change of scenery is what they needed, so they decided to travel forth. And that's where they are now. They just arrived after their travels. Just a change of scenery will be able to give us the right amount of grief. Moderate grief. That's what we're aiming for. Chapter 2. The next day, contrary to the prognostications of our guides, was fine, although clouded. We visited the forests of the Arverian and rode about the valley until evening. These sublime and magnificent scenes afforded me the greatest consolation that I was capable of receiving. They elevated me from all littleness of feeling, and although they did not remove my grief, they subdued and tranquilized it. In some degree, also, they diverted my mind from the thoughts over which it had brooded over the last month. I returned in the evening, fatigued, but less unhappy, and conversed with my family with more cheerfulness than had been my custom for some time. My father was pleased, and Elizabeth overjoyed. "My dear cousin," said she, "you see what happiness you diffuse when you are happy. Do not relapse again. Or else." The following morning, the rain poured down in torrents, and thick mists hid the summits of the mountains. I rose early, but felt unusually melancholy. The rain depressed me. My old feelings recurred, and I was miserable. I knew how disappointed my father would be at this sudden change, and I wished to avoid him until I had recovered myself, so far as to be enabled to conceal those feelings that overpowered me. I knew that they would remain that day at the inn, and as I had ever inured myself to rain, moisture, and cold, I resolved to go alone to the summit of Montanvert. I remembered the effect that the view of the tremendous and ever-moving glacier had produced upon my mind when I first saw it. It had filled me with a sublime ecstasy that gave wings to the soul and allowed it to soar from the obscure world to light and joy. The sight of the awful and majestic in nature had indeed always the effect of solemnizing my mind and causing me to forget the passing cares of life. I determined to go alone, for I was well acquainted with the path, and the presence of another would destroy the solitary grandeur of the scene. The ascent is precipitous, but the path is cut into continual and short windings, which enable you to surmount the perpendicularity of the mountain. It is a scene terrifically desolate. In 1,000 spots the traces of the winter avalanche may be perceived, where trees lie broken and strewed on the ground, some entirely destroyed, others bent, leaning upon the jutting rocks of the mountain or transversely upon other trees. The path, as you ascend higher, is intersected by ravines of snow, down which stones continually roll from above. One of them is particularly dangerous, as the slightest sound, such as even speaking in a loud voice, produces a concussion of air sufficient to draw destruction upon the head of the speaker. The pines are not tall or luxuriant, but they are somber, and add an air of severity to the scene. I looked on the valley beneath. Vast mists were rising from the rivers which ran through it and curling in thick wreaths around the opposite mountains, whose summits were hid in the uniform clouds, while rain poured from the dark sky and added to the melancholy impression I received from the objects around me. Alas, why does man boast of sensibilities superior to those apparent in the brute? It only renders them more necessary beings. If other impulses were confined to hunger, thirst, and desire, we might be nearly free. But now we are moved by every wind that blows, and a chance word or scene that word may convey to us. We rest. A dream has power to poison sleep. We rise. One wandering thought pollutes the day. We feel, conceive, or laugh, or reason, laugh, or weep. Embrace a fond woe, or cast our cares away. It is the same, for, be it joy or sorrow, the path of its departure still is free. Man's yesterday may never be like his tomorrow. Naught may endure but mutability. It was nearly noon when I arrived at the top of the ascent. For some time I sat upon the rock that overlooks the sea of ice. A mist covered both that and the surrounding mountains. Presently a breeze dissipated the cloud, and I descended upon the glacier. The surface is very uneven, rising like the waves of a troubled sea, descending low and interspersed by rifts that sink deep. The field of ice is almost a league in width, but I spent nearly 2 hours in crossing it. The opposite mountain is a bare perpendicular rock. From the side where I now stood, Montanvert was exactly opposite, at the distance of a league, and above it rose Mont Blanc in awful majesty. I remained in a recess of the rock, gazing on this wonderful and stupendous scene. The sea, or rather the vast river of ice, wound among its dependent mountains, whose aerial summits hung over its recesses. Their icy and glittering peaks shone in the sunlight over the clouds. My heart, which was before sorrowful, now swelled with something like joy. I exclaimed, "Wandering spirits, if indeed ye wander, and do not rest in your narrow beds, allow me this faint happiness, or take me, as your companion, away from the joys of life." As I said this, I suddenly beheld the figure of a man at some distance, advancing towards me with superhuman speed. Terrifying. He bounded over the crevices in the ice, among which I had walked with caution. His stature also, as he approached, seemed to exceed that of man. I was troubled. A mist came over my eyes, and I felt a faintness seize me. But I was quickly restored by the cold gale of the mountain. I perceived, as the shape came nearer, sight tremendous and abhorred, that it was the wretch whom I had created. I trembled with rage and horror, resolving to wait his approach, and then close with him in mortal combat. "Finish him." He approached. His countenance bespoke bitter anguish, combined with disdain and malignity, while its unearthly ugliness rendered it almost too horrible for human eyes. But I scarcely observed this. Anger and hatred had at first deprived me of utterance, and I recovered only to overwhelm him with words expressive of furious detestation and contempt. "Devil!" I exclaimed, "do you dare approach me? And do you not fear the fierce vengeance of my arm wreaked on your miserable head? Begone, vile insect! Or rather stay, that I may trample you to dust. And oh, that I could, with the extinction of your miserable existence, restore those victims whom you have diabolically murdered." "I expected this reception," said the demon. "Excuse me? He can talk?" Rude. Expected, but rude. All men hated the wretch. How then must I be hated? Who am miserable beyond all living things? Yet you, my creator, detest and spurn me, thy creature, to whom thou art bound by ties only dissoluble by the annihilation to one of us. You purpose to kill me. How dare you sport thus with life? Do your duty towards me, and I will do mine towards you and the rest of humankind. If you will comply with my conditions, I will leave them and you at peace. But if you refuse, I will glut the maw of death until it be satiated with the blood of your remaining friends." Okay, so Frankenstein's monster is a little peeved. And he's like, "Okay, Victor. Can I call you Victor? You did a terrible thing. And until you come clean and right all the wrongs that you have done, I'm gonna kill everybody that you know. So, up to you. Up to you." "Abhorred monster, fiend that thou art, the tortures of hell are too mild a vengeance for thy crimes. Wretched devil, you reproach me with your creation. Come on, then, that I may extinguish the spark which I so negligently bestowed." My rage was without bounds. I sprang on him, impelled by all the feelings which can arm one being against the existence of another. He easily eluded me, and— "Be calm. I entreat you to hear me, before you give vent to your hatred on my devoted head. Have I not suffered enough that you seek to increase my misery? Life, although it may only be an accumulation of anguish, is dear to me, and I will defend it. Remember, thou hast made me more powerful than thyself. My height is superior to thine, my joints more supple. But I will not be tempted to set myself in opposition to thee. I am thy creature, and I will be even mild and docile to my natural lord and king, if thou wilt also perform thy part, the which thou owest me. O Frankenstein, be not equitable to every other, and trample upon me alone, to whom thy justice and even thy clemency and affection is most due. Remember that I am thy creature. I ought to be thy Adam, but I am rather the fallen angel whom thou drivest from joy to no misdeed. Everywhere I see bliss, from which I alone am irrevocably excluded. I was benevolent and good. Misery made me a fiend. Make me happy, and I shall again be virtuous. Okay, so we're making some demands. This monster read a lot of Shakespeare. I know there's a lot of knowest, a lot of vows. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely you did. I mean, what else are you gonna do? You got murder, you got Shakespeare. How else are you gonna spend your time? Oh, here we are. I was like, I've lost my spat. Begone. I will not hear you. There can be no community between you and me. We are enemies. Begone, or let us try our strength in a fight, in which one must fall. Okay, let's remember that Victor, we do not know any of his training. He's just a little science dweebo, which is perfectly fine. Totally cool. Um, but this monster that he's created is 8 feet tall. I feel like the monster would win. I just have that feeling. Just have it. How can I move thee? Will no entreaties cause thee to turn a favorable eye upon thy creature, who implores thy goodness and compassion? Believe me, Frankenstein, I was benevolent. My soul glowed with love and humanity. But am I not alone, miserably alone? You, my creator, abhor me. What hope can I gather from your fellow creatures who owe me nothing? They spurn and hate me. The desert mountains and dreary glaciers are my refuge. I have wandered here many days. The caves of ice, which I only do not fear, are a dwelling to me, and the only one which man does not grudge. These bleak skies I hail, for they are kinder to me than your fellow beings. If the multitude of mankind knew of my existence, they would do as you do, and arm themselves for my destruction. Shall I not then hate them who abhor me? I will keep no terms with my enemies. I am miserable, and they shall share my wretchedness. Yet it is in your power to recompense me, and deliver them from an evil which it only remains for you to make so great, that not only you and your family, but thousands of others, shall be swallowed up in the whirlwinds of its rage. Let your compassion be moved, and do not disdain me. Do not disdain me. Listen to my tale. When you have heard that, abandon or commiserate me, as you shall judge that I deserve. But hear me. The guilty are allowed by human laws, bloody as they may be, to speak in their own defense before they are condemned. Listen to me, Frankenstein. You accuse me of murder, and yet you would, with a satisfied conscience, destroy your own creature. Oh, praise the eternal justice of man. Yet I ask you not to spare me. Listen to me, and then, if you can, and you will, destroy the work of your hands. Why do you call to my remembrance circumstances of which I shudder to reflect, that I have been the miserable origin and author? Cursed be the day, abhorred devil, in which you first saw light. Cursed, although I curse myself, be the hands that formed you. You have made me wretched beyond expression. You have left me no power to consider whether I am just to you or not. Begone! Relieve me from the sight of your detested form. Thus I relieve thee, my creator, he said, and placed his hated hands before my eyes, which I flung from me with violence. Thus I take from thee a sight which you abhor. Still thou canst listen to me, and grant me thy compassion. By the virtues that I once possessed, I demand this from you. Hear my tale. It is long and strange, and the temperature of this place is not fitting to your fine sensations. Come to the hut upon the mountain. The sun is yet high in the heavens, before it descends to hide itself beyond yon snowy precipices, and illuminate another world. You will have heard my story, and can decide. On you it rests, whether I quit forever the neighborhood of man and lead a harmless life, or become the scourge of your fellow creatures and the author of your own speedy ruin. As he said this, he led the way across the ice. I followed. My heart was full, and I did not answer him, but as I proceeded, I weighed the various arguments that he had used, and determined at least to listen to his tale. I was partly urged by curiosity, and compassion confirmed my resolution. I had hitherto supposed him to be the murderer of my brother, and I eagerly sought a confirmation or denial of this opinion. For the first time, also, I felt that the duties of a creator towards his creature were, and that I ought to render him happy before I complained of his wickedness. These motives urged me to comply with his demand. We crossed the ice, therefore, and ascended the opposite rock. The air was cold, and the rain again began to descend. We entered the hut, the fiend with an air of exultation, I with a heavy heart and depressed spirits. But I consented to listen, and, seating myself by the fire which my odious companion had lighted, he thus began his tale. End of chapter 2. Okay, so, part 2, chapter 2. What do we got? So we're in our new place, living life. We're actually a little happier. We being Victor. Victor's a little bit happier. Every once in a while, he, cuts a rug. Is that a good thing? Does that phrase mean a good thing? Because that's exactly what I want it to be. He's spreading joy to Elizabeth, and Elizabeth is like, hey, you're doing good things. Don't ever be sad again. And one day he's hiking up the mountain and he comes across a person who is inhumanly fast. And he's like, I know exactly who this is. And then he just starts yelling at this person who it turns out to be his monster, his creation. And his creation is like, okay, rude, but also expected. And also, I'm giving you a choice here, okay? I can live peacefully here, or I can go down to humanity and be a terror. And also, why did you do this to me? Why? And if you do not right your wrongs, I will kill all of your friends and family. So the choice is yours. Bye. But not really bye, because he's gonna go and tell Victor his story, so like his side of things. Which again, why does he speak with like Shakespearean words? I don't understand. Recently born, owns a house, fluent in Shakespeare. Say he's doing pretty good for himself. Yeah. I don't understand why. Why is this the like difference in speaking that Mary Shelley has picked? It's just interesting because nobody else is speaking so like in that way. Like I don't understand. Like it would make more sense if he didn't talk at all, or if his speaking was more stunted, or if you're gonna like have him be fluently in speaking, then make it like how the people he's around are speaking. Like that's where he would have gotten his speech, right? I don't understand. He murdered the kid and then went to a local theater, saw Hamlet, never turned back. He's living life. Yes. Okay, question. Does he use the head to do his monologue? I'm just saying. Mary Shelley was going through her Shakespearean phrase. Yeah, exactly. It's not a phase, mom. He found the cliff notes. Sure. In one interpretation of Frankenstein, it explained that he learned language mainly from, okay, from reading poetry. That makes sense. Okay. That totally makes sense why he speaks like that then. Okay, cool. And we will probably get more um in like when he tells the story. So until next time, we'll start his story next week. I'm intrigued. I'm intrigued though. Am I still enjoying this? Yes. Yes, I am. I know, cliffhanger. I know. I know. It's how I keep you coming back. Yes, I am still enjoying this. I'm here for the vibes. I'm here for the Shakespearean monster. I'm here for, yeah, just pointing out silliness as well. Like, some of the characters are just beyond silly, and I don't understand them. Like Justine. Like, why? Why would you do this, Justine? I don't understand you. And I'm pretty sure it's not just like a commentary of the time. You know what I mean? Like, I'm pretty sure that people in that time weren't just admitting to murder because that was the thing to do. So I don't understand. We'll see. We'll see. Well, not excited about the Shakespeare, but yes, excited to see the monsters. I don't like calling him monster or demon. He is a product of his own time. Of our good friend creation. To see what it's like. That's the one dumb difference. In the edited version, oh, gotcha. He has free will, or he has no free will or personality there. Interesting. And yeah, that is definitely like an interesting choice to change that. Hmm. I'm wondering if, and I guess I could probably look into this, but this is just me wondering aloud with not knowing the answer at all. But I'm wondering if some of the changes that she made in the, so we're reading the 1818 version, but I'm wondering if some of the changes that she made in the 1831 version are changes that she received criticism for in the 1818 version, or if they're all just like this would have been better if it was this way and like her own doing, you know what I mean? Or if there was like outside pressures for it. So yeah, that's gonna be it for today. We will pick up right where we left off with Frankenstein. I was like, what is his name? Frankenstein's monsters, because he doesn't have a name. Frankenstein's monsters perspective. So I hope you all have a great night. So have a good night, everyone. If I don't see you next time, I hope to see you very soon. As always, whether you lurk, whether you chat, I 1000% appreciate you, and I 1000% appreciate your support. Bye.